The territories of Siberia and the Far East, the Arctic and the Subarctic hold immense treasures, huge reserves of oil, gas, gold, precious stones and metals. In addition, the gigantic forest masses in Siberia provide a huge amount of wood for any purpose. And perhaps that's why various conquerors have been tearing into Russia for centuries. However, something in this explanation does not add up. Extracting all these resources in extreme polar conditions is difficult and heavy, and the territory of Russia itself is fiercely protected by local residents and Russian peoples, Bashkirs, Tatars, Buryats and so on. It would seem much easier to just buy these same resources cheaply, leaving the extraction work to the Russians themselves, as in Saudi Arabia for instance. Moreover, any attempts at conquest are practically useless. The enemy turns out to be completely defeated and destroyed. And if there were any attempts that were successful, like the strange war with Pugachev, no less strange war with Napoleon, and a very strange seizure of power by the Poles, in turbulent times, those who unexpectedly seized the territory themselves became its guardians, or they were driven out by the simple people. The history of the former guardians was erased, rewritten, the invaders became defenders, and now Europe's wrath was turned against them. Yes, what's wrong with you, Russia? Second episode. You are on the Epoch of Distrust channel with Mikhail Kalmykov. And now we will continue our conversation about the oddities and mystical riddles of Russia, about its connection with the gods and its role in all this mess. In itself, everything said further is just a product of my imagination, in which I, however, believe, and that's why I share my thoughts with you. We will delve into the symbolism, flags, their meanings and interpretations. And all these are very deep concepts, which are always held in thoughts, fantasies and guesses. Sometimes one person, sometimes several. For example, the same white color on the flag will officially represent one thing in Russia, another in France, a third in the United States of America, and a fourth in Britain. Therefore, do not expect clear mathematical facts in this investigation. By definition, they cannot exist. The world of meanings is a world of shadows. Koschei moros haris. In the last episode, we stopped at the point that Russia has some mysterious connection with the ancient Greek Tartarus, the kingdom of the dead, which caused a catastrophe, covering it with an icy shield of eternal frost, sealing it with a layer of clay and dirt. It was probably this clay ice shield that the ancient Greek poet Hesiod had in mind when he spoke of the bronze gates of Tartarus built by Poseidon, and there rules the native brother of Zeus, Hades. Let's stop again at this character. What other connection could Hades have with Russia besides the fact that Tartarus is apparently located there? After all, in Russian legends and fairy tales, Hades is never mentioned, but Koschei the Deathless is. And the very characteristic of being deathless already speaks of his belonging to the gods, but the name Koschei doesn't resemble the name Hades at all. And here's where the most interesting part begins. The first mentions of this character in literature probably appeared in Pushkin's fairy tales. There he is simply called Tsar Koschei. One might think that this is his name, but it's not. The word Koschei, according to many researchers, has etymology from the meaning of the word bone. Well, it can't be a name of bones, so it's not a name but a definition. Something like Mithridates, Pontius, Alexander, Macedonian, or even the terrible, only the name in this case is hidden behind the nickname Tsar Macedonian, Tsar Pontius, or Tsar Terrible. And here similarly it turns out literally Tsar Bones, Tsar Dead, but this is not a name, but a function, Tsar Bones. Also, according to one version, the word Koschei or Koschei meant the servant running the Shatro-Palatka of the master Koshem. Such a version, however, it also says that Koschei is a duty, not a name. Moreover, this is the one who managed the tent, the covering, that is, in some sense, he also managed what covers the kingdom of the dead Tartar. And again it turns out that Koschei is not a name but a definition. This is just the immortal king of bones. Yes, he can't be mortal in principle. If he is the ruler of the kingdom of the dead, he is by definition immortal, and his name is not mentioned in Russian fairy tales. By the way, about Russian folk tales, they are folk maybe, but each of these tales has a specific literary author. For example, Pushkin, who mentions Koschei at the very beginning of Ruslan and Lyudmila, or Vasily Zhukovsky, who tells about Koschei in the tale about Tsar Berendei, or Alexander Afanasyev, who wrote the tale Tsarevna Frog. Koschei the Immortal was also present there. In fact, Alexander Afanasyev became one of the authors of Russian folk tales. In any case, he played a major role in this process, collecting Russian folk legends, which, by the way, were rejected by the censors at the time. In fact, the censorship followed him all his life on all fronts, but that's a separate, big story. In his fairy tales, Afanasyev often mentioned both Koschei the Immortal and his magical things. One such item was the cap of invisibility. Anyone who put it on became invisible. For example, in one of Afanasyev's fairy tales, 3 maidens would run through the night from their father to frolic in the underground king's palace. It's understood that you can't explain in a children's fairy tale why and to whom the maidens were actually running, considered them witches, and who is this underground king, really? But from the context, it's quite clear that it's Koschei. I'll remind you that the cap of invisibility in Russian fairy tales was first mentioned by Afanasyev and Pushkin. In Pushkin's Ruslan and Lyudmila, this cap belonged to the immortal sorcerer Chernomor. Consider him Chernobog. There is also a Buryat fairy tale about the cap of invisibility, but it doesn't say a word about whose it is and where it came from. Judging by the content of the fairy tale, it was most likely stolen by someone a long time ago. Why did I even remember about the cap of invisibility? And to the fact that the first mentions of it are not actually in Russian folk tales, not from Pushkin, Zhukovsky, Afanasyev, but in ancient Greek antiquity. Invisibility cap. It is a mandatory attribute of Titan Hades, just as mandatory as the 3-headed dog Cerberus. And this fact again firmly links the 2 characters into one. Hades and Koschei are one and the same. In general, leaders and even more so gods always have several names, as does Hades. In addition to being the king of bones, he is also the king of frost. We learn this from the fairy tale The Snow Maiden. Of course, he does not directly call Koschei the Frost, but a lot suggests that it is the same character. Both the kingdom of Koschei and the kingdom of Frost are not far from the kingdom of Berendei. Both are associated with frozen water, both are not far from Lucomorie, and so on. It's also worth remembering that Grandfather Frost in Russian fairy tales is far from the kind-hearted character he is depicted as today. No, his other name is Karachin or Chernobog. In fact, the word Kara in some languages means black. But even in early collections of fairy tales compiled by the same Afanasyev, Ostrovsky, and others, Grandfather Frost is not entirely kind, but he is not evil either. He is rather fair, and this fairness of his is fatal. On the edge of life and death, he constantly tests those who meet him. Passed the exam, left alive and with gifts, didn't pass, died. Exactly. Koschei does the same thing. For example, in the tale about Tsar Berendei, he gives Ivan tests that seem like a dirty trick to the reader because they are impossible to perform. However, with the help of Koschei's cunning daughter, the hero manages to pass the test. But didn't Koschei know who was really performing his tasks? Can we seriously think that the immortal wizard, a magician, a god is so stupid? After all, he has many daughters and they all also possess magic and they are all wise. No, in fact, Koschei is not testing Ivan, whom he could crush with a flick of his fingers, but one of his daughters, to understand how deeply she has fallen in love. After all, how else to explain the whole operation of Koschei to bring Ivan Tsarevich into his kingdom, which began even before his birth, and how else to explain why Ivan was needed by Koschei at all? This operation was meticulously planned by Koschei for many years before the plot of the fairy tale unfolded. In fact, he simply invited the suitors to look at his daughters, who thus chose their husbands. And almost the same plot is in the fairy tale The Snow Maiden. Apparently, the last remaining daughter of Frost really begs her father to go to the people she wants love, dances, and marriage. Pay attention that in Ostrovsky's play, that is, in the original source, where the character Snow Maiden appeared from, she is not at all the granddaughter of Father Frost, but his daughter. If you look at the character of Hades, he is also not evil and not good. He is very responsible for his duty, and more likely fair, with the same prohibitive fairness as Koschei. For example, the hellish torments that Hades inflicts on Sisyphus or Tantalus, these two have earned more than Hades himself. Always keeps his word precisely. Maybe that's why he's considered evil? But, on the other hand, there's no difference for the god between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Whether you're alive or dead, he sees both worlds, unlike people. He loves music, poetry, and power, but despises submission, cunning, or observation, which characterizes him as a very wise intellectual. In fact, in the same Greek mythology, Hades, although the most unloved god, because he still rules the kingdom of the dead, but at the same time is considered the most attentive, the most hospitable god, as well as the god of fertility and the master of wealth in general. Here's another direct parallel with Koschei. Hades was the first eldest son of Kronos, and in the War of the Gods, Titanomachy showed himself as one of the best gods' warriors. And since he is the elder brother of Zeus, he should have inherited the power over the world by right. After him, by seniority, the power should have gone to Poseidon, but everything was decided by the lot, which was cast by the brothers Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades after the end of the Titanomachy, and according to this lot, Hades got Tartarus. So say the Greek myths. Interestingly, Hades is present not only in Greek or Roman mythology, he is also in Etruscan myths. And this is what is notable. Firstly, there has long been a conspiracy theory that the Etruscans are, in fact, the Russians. It's the Russians, the Etruscans. Popularizers of official history try to ridicule this theory, as it is considered conspiratorial. However, some facts cannot be ignored, for example, the fact that this Russian language was long considered unreadable. However, at the end of the 19th century, three scholars, Pole Tadeusz Walański, Italian Sebastiana Ciampi, and Russian Alexander Chertkov, claimed that the key to deciphering Etruscan texts lies in the Slavic languages. And after that, this language immediately became readable. Indeed, it is very difficult to consider any text unreadable when there are plenty of Slavic-speaking countries around Italy. One can only fail to see the similarity if it has been simply forbidden to do so for a long time, or, let's say, not accepted. And there you have a conspiracy. Secondly, for some reason, historians stubbornly ignore the fact that, for example, Virgil in his time and on his own, describing the flight of Aeneas from Troy, he speaks in the words of the gods that Aeneas must find a place in Italy where his ancestors were founded. Moreover, he speaks in such a way as if the main homeland was here, at Troy, and in Italy there was only a distant, so to speak, surviving enclave of his ancestors. And these ancestors are Etruscans, and if we accept the fact that Troy is actually Taganrog, then the main homeland of the Etruscans is Russia. Thirdly, the Etruscans have their own analog of the god Hades, who is called Aita or Aita. However, watch out for the cunning of Hans. This is what this word looks like in Etruscan. As we already know, the Etruscan language is Slavic. Therefore, Etruscan inscriptions should be read according to the rules of Slavic languages. But for some conspiratorial reason, official historians read the Etruscan letter A according to the rules of the English language, where the letter A is read as A or I. So we get some kind of Eta or Eta instead of just a simple Russian Atia or Ati, that is Ad, or more precisely Atia, Asia, Asia. It turns out that Ad and Atia are literally the same thing. Literally, Asia is the place where Hades rules. Moreover, if you read this word from right to left, it literally becomes Hades. It should be clarified that some letters are interchangeable. Such letters, for example, are T, Z, S, I. Sometimes even F falls into this category. For example, you can read both Atia and Asia, and Asia you can read Fyodor or Theodore. In any case, the word as and the word as can definitely be considered the same word, and with the new ones introduced into this series, you can add both ad and ad. In light of this, Scandinavian mythology begins to play with new colors. In any case, good Odin, he, like Hades, is the firstborn. Hades is the eldest son of Kronos, and Odin is the first of the Aesir, and Odin and Hades both love poetry, hate flatterers, and rule the underworld. Both are distinguished by their exceptional justice, hospitality, and fatalism. However, there are also many differences. Symbols. Now let's try to understand the intricacies of the politics of Greek gods and titans. In itself, hundreds of years have already passed. Everything has been mixed and turned into a fine vinaigrette. And to unequivocally declare that this state or this religion serves such and such a god and this one serves such and such is absolutely impossible. Error. In any case, we can certainly orient ourselves and anticipate based on their actions and symbolism. For example, the symbol of the eagle, which was adopted by the Roman Empire, is unequivocally a symbol of Zeus. The symbol of the eagle carries the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Third Reich, yes, practically all European countries. Plus, the eagle is present on the coats of arms of Egypt, Zambia, Nigeria, Jordan, Iraq, Armenia, and of course the United States of America. On the one hand, such an abundance of absolutely dissimilar countries with the same totems on their coats of arms should put an end to any attempts to figure it out. On the other hand, some interpretations of the presence of the eagle on the coat of arms do not withstand criticism, such as the manifestation of power. Of course, the eagle is a proud bird, but for the demonstration of power manifestation. For example, I would have put a bear or a tiger on the coat of arms, or maybe even a lion, but not an eagle. Nevertheless, a huge number of countries have precisely an eagle on their coat of arms, which is a symbol of Zeus. By the way, some countries did not follow the general trend and put a lion on their coat of arms. and not just one, for example, Great Britain. It would seem the most logical option, which I just argued. So there should be no speculations and conspiracy theories about Britain. According to my assumption and just simple logic, it turns out that England does not fit into my system at all. Because for some time, and maybe even now, it rules most of the world. But despite this, she has no symbol of an eagle, which means she cannot belong to Zeus. All this is true, if only one small nuance is not known. The lion as a symbol is present in some ancient gods and even in two. The first is Apollo, the god of light and the sun. Sounds impressive, but somehow it doesn't quite fit the specifics of Britain. But the second god is Hera, the queen of the gods. And the last one, Zeus's main wife. For the sake of accuracy, it should be clarified that the lion is never officially mentioned as a symbol of Hera, but I am still convinced that this is the case. To prove this fact, one would have to recall and raise a lot of materials and seemingly unrelated facts, conduct a whole investigation with the inevitable stretching of the poor owl. That's why I'll make this material a separate video a bit later after this film is released on platforms for sponsors. And now we continue. And here we immediately recall the strange periods of female rule in Britain, starting from the 12th century, when England was ruled by Matilda of Anjou. In the 16th century, Lady Jane Grey, then the famous Mary Tudor, Elizabeth Mary, Queen Anne, Queen Victoria, and ending with the unprecedented, in terms of duration, rule of Queen Elizabeth, who alone ruled for the last 70 years. For some, this is a whole life from birth to death, but for Elizabeth, these were just years of rule. For all official history of mankind, if not taking into account myths and legends, only Louis ruled longer than Elizabeth. And this is just a list of those British queens who ruled alone, but how many women ruled not alone in Britain? Well, the same Margaret Thatcher, for example. One thing can be said for sure. Thus, the symbolism of the lion fits very well into the proposed structure of Britain, which is ruled by Hera, the wife of Zeus. And again, from this point of view, one can well explain the combined symbols on the coat of arms of the same country. For example, the already mentioned Armenia. It has both an eagle and a lion on its coat of arms, which can be considered a joint rule of Hera and Zeus. And where did Prometheus go? What is his symbol? Many might think that the symbol of Prometheus is a torch or chains, and that's correct, but no country has a torch or chains in its symbolism. Although, wait, here's a torch, the Statue of Liberty. It's a bit of a stretch though, let's remember that. However, Prometheus has another symbol, and strangely enough, it's also an eagle. That is, not every state with an eagle as a symbol is necessarily under the patronage of Zeus. Perhaps it's his brother Prometheus. And again, the United States of America, the fakel and the eagle. By the way, here are the chains at the feet of the Statue of Liberty and in the symbolism of the states, where each state represents one link in the chain. Impressive. All three symbols of Prometheus are in the symbolism of the United States of America. Let's go further. If we continue to follow this logic, then two eagles can symbolize the union of the forces of Prometheus and Zeus, both of whom have the eagle as their main symbol. And suddenly, this version excellently explains the hidden meaning of the monument to the heroes of the War of 1812, erected in Smolensk. It's called Grateful Russia. It's very detailed in the video clip of Svetlana from the same channel. His composition has long raised puzzling questions about the symbol he keeps. Remember, On the monument there are two eagles, one on top of the monument fighting with an ancient warrior trying to overthrow him, and the second eagle on the side looks beaten, and both eagles seem to be defending their nest. At first glance everything makes sense. At Smolensk, two Russian armies of Barclay de Tolly and Bagration united, and there they fought Napoleon's army. However, something doesn't add up. For example, why the second rooster seems defeated, why the first rooster seems like the victor. After all, in reality, the battle for Smolensk lasted only 2 days, at the end of which Smolensk was surrendered to the French. Something doesn't fit. What if we look at the monument from a different perspective? The first eagle distracts the attention of the ancient warrior, and the second is not damaged, but is sneaking up from the other side of the obelisk to the warrior in a roundabout way. Then it turns out that the first army's first eagle is obvious, and the second is preparing to strike in the back. Since symbolism is important here, the first key hint is, in fact, the ancient warrior, specifically ancient, and this is exactly the key, saying that the meaning of the monument should be sought in antiquity. Otherwise, nothing would have prevented depicting a normal soldier of those times on the monument in a shako with a saber and a musket. But no, the warrior is specifically ancient Greek, who literally screams it with his whole appearance. The history of this resistance to antiquity. And why is the warrior specifically Greek, not Roman? The local here will remember that it was the Roman soldiers who wore such armor and swords, while the Greeks marched in phalanx with long spears. If we see a warrior with a sword, then it means he's a Roman. But no. Firstly, spear bearers were in any armies at that time, including the Romans. But just as certainly there were swordsmen in any armies. For example, heavily armed Greek hoplites, when it came time for close combat, would throw their 4 to 6 meter spear and also fight with swords. How can we determine whether the warrior before us is a Greek or a Roman? Who are you, warrior? Let's take a closer look at his clothing and weapon. The sword resembles a Roman gladius, but it's longer and more closely resembles a Greek xiphos. However, the xiphos has a leaf-shaped blade, so it's not a xiphos, but it's not a gladius either. The sheath is on the left side, so it's definitely not a Roman gladius, because gladius were carried on the right side. But it's not a Greek xiphos either, although it was carried on the left side, but very high, almost under the armpit. However, the sheaths were on the left side of the Roman spatha. It is indeed longer than the gladius and generally fits. 6 helmets. Such helmets were worn not only by Roman legionnaires but also by Greek soldiers. In particular, it most resembles the so-called Greek Attic helmet. Dospech. This is definitely a Greek linothorax. The Romans have similar lorica segmentata, but the characteristic laces are definitely in favor of the Greek linothorax. It turns out to be some kind of mixed pickles. Judging by the sword, it's a Roman gladiator. They specifically wore the tunic. If judging by the armor, then he's a Greek since he's dressed in a linothorax. Both sides had similar crested helmets. So perhaps someone third is meant, not a Greek or a Roman, but the one who combines their common features. And yes, all the listed characteristics fit the ancestors of the Romans and the Greek brothers, the Trojans and the Etruscans. But the helmet with a crest still directly relates us to the times of the Trojan War. I am referring to an old image on an antique vase, dated as far back as 500 years before our era. It is now kept in a museum in Berlin. This vase depicts a soldier bandaging the arm of a wounded comrade, and this soldier has exactly the same armor as on the monument. Yes, and the helmet is similar. It is believed that this is Achilles bandaging his brother Patroclus. However, I believe this isn't so. Firstly, because the Iliad does not report that Patroclus was ever wounded in the hand. Secondly, because the vase was found in the necropolis of Campasciano in Vulci in southern Etruria, and we remember with you that Achilles fought against the Trojans who sailed to Italy to their ancestors, the Etruscans. That is, a vase glorifying the enemy would hardly have ended up in the Etruscan necropolis. And fourthly, as we know, Achilles only had one set of armor, forged by Hephaestus. And in the drawings, he appears in one, then in another, then in a third. There are other inconsistencies as well. The main thing is that, judging by the drawing on the vase, this is most likely an Etruscan warrior. The vase itself was found in the year 1828, so it could very well have been a model for the warrior figure. So, as strange as it may seem, the monument most likely depicts an Etruscan or Trojan warrior. So, we figured out the state affiliation of the warrior. Next come the direct symbols, that is, eagles, and these are the symbols of Zeus and Prometheus. Who among the opposing sides had these symbols? Of course, in Napoleon's army and in Alexander's army, that is, the Russian army. It is believed that the eagles symbolize the union of two Russian armies near Smolensk. However, the explanation is so-so because, having united, they immediately surrendered Smolensk and continued to retreat. There is no talk of any impropriety of Smolensk. However, if you look at the composition from a different point of view, what if there were three armies in the battle, two under the symbol of an eagle and the third from ancient times? Then everything changes dramatically. This fact explains the strange behavior of Napoleon's army, which was not heading for St. Petersburg, which was the capital, but for Moscow. This also explains Napoleon's even stranger letter to Alexander I. Here is his text. Dear Sovereign, my brother, there is no more beautiful, proud city than Moscow. You have raised it, set it on fire. I started the war against your majesty without malice. One note from you before or after the last battle would have stopped my advance, and I actually wanted to give you the advantage of being the first to enter Moscow. If your majesty still harbors any of those former feelings, you will graciously accept this letter. Nevertheless, you can only acknowledge me for the fact that I hold myself accountable for what is happening in Moscow. Therefore, my dear sovereign, my brother, I pray to God that He may guard your majesty and keep you under His holy and worthy protection. Let not the lines in which Napoleon speaks of his initiation of war against your majesty disturb you. At the end of the day, there are also screw-ups in the Allied armies. However, the following lines are much more serious, that if it were not for the conflict between them, Napoleon would have given Alexander the right to enter Moscow first. That is, it turns out that even if Napoleon had not gone to war with Russia, Emperor Alexander still could not have entered Moscow without fear. That is, Moscow did not belong to Alexander. It was a joint campaign of two brothers, as stated directly in the letter to Moscow, with the further development of events in India. Although what India, it is in a different direction. And forced to retreat again. To clarify, most of the materials on the War of 1812 were written half a century or more after it. For example, War and Peace was published in 1868, and the memoirs of General Yermolov, on which a significant part of the history of this war is based, were published in 1863. That is, 2 years after his death and 50 years after the end of the war. On the one hand, there is nothing surprising about this, and on the other hand, how much we can trust them is enough to judge by one fact. According to the words of the general's friend and brother, Artillery Captain Nikolai Berg, Jacob once told him a story about how, in his youth, he himself appeared to him from the future and dictated all his memoirs to him, right down to the exact date and time of his death, including the French campaign itself. That is, we are reading not just Yermolov's memoirs, but a story dictated by the ghost of Yermolov to himself. A very interesting map of Russia, which is depicted on the monument itself, a very clear and large map, cut exactly along the border of the Ural Mountains. That is, in the year 1812, Russia was only up to the border of the Urals. Or does the map show the territories that the victors reached at the end of the war? But how so? Where did the conquests of Siberia by Yermak, Dezinev, Remezov and other pioneers go? Where is Catherine's conquest? This is one of the yet unsolved mysteries. Although many bloggers have noticed these inconsistencies and have long been raising the question of what beyond the Ural Mountains began a different territory. Tartor, or as we found out in the first series, the hidden eternal Maya kingdom of Hades, that very mythical India where Alexander the Great actually went. And yes, if we continue Napoleon's journey further, we will end up in the Ural Mountains in Siberia, ancient India, Tartor. And if you still have any doubts or you think that the arguments are not enough, just look at the overall composition of the monument in relation to geography. Yes, geographical ties for monuments are very important. All symbolism is based on them. And what do we see when we look at this monument, approaching it with a compass? And the next picture. The composition of the monument is located along Dzerzhinsky Street, and the eagles are on it from the west side. That is, they came from the west, to be precise, somewhere from the side of Riga, and the ancient warrior is just from the side of Moscow. Could it be thought that the sculptor Nadolsky and the architect Schutzmann, making a monument to our heritage from the west in the 1914th year, forgot about the sides of the world? The symbol of Russia on its coat of arms is a double-headed eagle, but in light of the above, it can mean the patronage or simultaneous rule of two Greek gods who have the symbol of the eagle, that is Zeus and Prometheus. Their interest here is mutual. By the way, when did the eagle appear on the coat of arms of Russia? It is believed this occurred during the reign of Ivan III the Great. After he married Sophia Palaiologina, he copied the symbolism of the Roman Empire, and before that, our symbol was a lion tearing a snake. However, the double-headed eagle entered the state coat of arms 2 generations later under his grandson Ivan the Terrible, but still did not make it onto the flag. On Ivan the Terrible's flag at that time, there was a man on a white horse, who historians believe to be Jesus. However, where and when in his life Jesus traveled on a white horse, I personally do not know. There is a version that it is Christ who is described as the first rider of the apocalypse, sitting on a white horse, but this is also a very controversial version. In any case, someone holy, depicted on the flag of Grozny on a horse, is definitely not Jesus. There is a second rider on a winged horse in his name. He seems to be leading an army behind him. And it is considered by official historians that this is Archangel Michael. However, I cannot agree here, since Archangel Michael did not have a horse, he was on foot. And most importantly, winged horses are not mentioned in the Old Testament, but they are mentioned in Greek mythology. And there was only one man who managed to tame the winged horse Pegasus. This is the Greek prince hero Bellerophon. What relation Bellerophon has to Russia is hard to say. You judge for yourself. In fact, the fate of Bellerophon is very sad. At first, having won quite a few victories and receiving the Corinthian kingdom and the winged horse Pegasus as a prize, he became arrogant and decided to fly to the gods on Olympus personally. As a result, he ended up lame, blind, and abandoned by everyone until the end of his life. However, at the end of his life, he still realized his pride and reconciled. Perhaps there is some mystical thread connecting him with Russia, but a more serious connection, I think, are the places where he was read, among which is the so-called Karya. And we remember from the last episode that Karya was probably not in Turkey, as is now believed, but on the shores of the Black Sea and the Kara River. That is, he could have been one of the Princess Berendiev as an option. In other words, it's a mystery that still needs to be solved. So, starting with Ivan, according to the symbology, Russia becomes an area of interest for Zeus and Prometheus. Gradually, over several generations, the double-headed eagle rises from Ivan's personal seal to the status of Russia's coat of arms. Moreover, initially, a unicorn was depicted on the chest of the double-headed eagle, and a little later it was replaced by the Moscow symbol of a horseman slaying a serpent, which is now called Saint George the Victorious. But the point is that, as we can see, this is just an attempt to mask this strange man on the winged horse of Bellerophon. If you think this is a stretch stretched over the globe, then read the story of this very Bellerophon. Suddenly it turns out that one of his exploits is the victory over Chimera, and on Greek bas-reliefs he is depicted exactly like this, a rider on a winged horse piercing the overturned Chimera with a spear. As they say, find 10 differences from Georgia Pobedonosca. By the way, the Chimera, which is characteristically three-headed in the original, and each head is from different animals, here is just a space for analogies and fantasies, starting with the three-headed dog of Hades Cerberus, the three-headed snake Gorinic, the ancient Greek Hydra, and even ending with the Old Testament Tetramorph. But at the moment we are interested in the two-headed eagle. After the two-headed eagle clearly established itself as the coat of arms of Russia under Ivan the Terrible, the next step should be its transition to the flag. This happened, but under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the eagle on the flag was quite small, an insignificant figure. However, the first Russian war frigate was built for sailing in the Caspian region. The same Dutchmen built it for us, who are a branch of the Oldenburg dynasty, about whom I have told a lot in previous episodes and with whom Peter subsequently tried to intermarry, which eventually happened. So, the first frigate of the Russian fleet was named Vernoy Oriol, and the first thing this ship did in its history, it did nothing. Its first and only voyage was from the shipyard to. From Dedenevo to Astrakhan, it never set sail again, was captured by Stepan Razin's Cossacks, and according to one version, it was burned, and according to another version, it rotted. Sadly, nonetheless, the fact remains that the very first frigate of the European type in Russian history was named Orel, followed by Peter I. Already in the year 1693, the flag that we know as white-blue-red appeared, with a single and enormous double-headed eagle in the center. But this was the flag of the Tsar of Moscow specifically, and it was raised on a 12-gun yacht. St. Peter, August 6, 1693, and a few weeks later, for some reason, it was removed and given to Archbishop Afanasy, and until the 20th century it was kept in Arkhangelsk. The feeling that the new flag was sent somewhere, let's say for approval. Meanwhile, on the coat of arms of Peter I in 1696, there was still a double-headed eagle on a red background. However, besides him, there were other characters, in particular the already familiar unknown man on a white horse, who is considered to be Christ, and two clearly saints, holding some book, most likely, the Bible. And only after 30 years, The white-blue-red flag reappears as the trade flag of Russia, but this time without the eagle. And yet another 15 years later, this flag was officially confirmed by the maritime law. That is, it turns out that the flag actually went for approval with someone, and someone did not like the presence of the eagle on it. Such a state of affairs did not last long. Already in the year 1730, Empress Anna Ivanovna introduced a black-yellow-white flag. Unexpectedly, more precisely, black-orange-white, or even more precisely, black-orange-silver. And how to understand this? What does this mean? But let's think first of all, why such colors? The official version is roughly like this. Black color is either the color of a black eagle or the color of the church. Yellow color is also the color of an eagle, but Byzantine, according to another version, it is the color of nobility or simply the royal color. The explanation, honestly, is about nothing, and the white color is either also the color of the church or also the color of nobility or the color of George the Victorious. In general, everything is so obvious in quotes that the brain explodes in attempts to understand the logic that Anna Ivanovna was guided by, but everything unexpectedly falls into place. If you open the program and invert the colors, that is, change each color to the opposite, it suddenly becomes clear that these colors are simply opposite. By the color palette, the white-blue-red flag changes white to the opposite, black-blue changes to the opposite yellow, in some cases orange, and the opposite of dark red is light blue, which can be taken for white or silver. That is, Anna Ivanovna directly reflected on the flag the reversal of the end of the Romanov dynasty's rule and the beginning of rule under a different leadership. The same combination, which is now accepted to consider as Georgian black, orange and silver, is a symbol of the reversal in Russia, the change of the patronage to the opposite. And who could have thought of such a thing? Definitely not Prometheus or Zeus, their symbols are eagles. Then who? Yes, indeed, the one who loves to stir and turn everything upside down. The opposite of a man is a woman, Hera, the wife of Zeus, who protects Britain. And literally, in confirmation of this version, over the course of almost an entire century, after this, Russia is ruled by women, exactly the same as in England, which are continuously sponsored. Yes, it can't be. From England, especially Ekaterina, who took so many credits in England that we were paying them off until the end of the 20th century. Based on this, one can assume that colors are also not random and have a relation to each of the gods. As we remember, after the victory in Titan, the question arose, who among the gods will rule? There were 3 sons of Kronos who defeated him, so there are 3 colors: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They cast lots and each got some dominion. Poseidon got the rule of the seas and oceans, so it's obvious that his color is blue, the color of water. The rule of people and accordingly the supreme power went to Zeus. Therefore, his color is white, the color of clouds, the color of the sky, the color of light. Well, Hades got the underworld, the kingdom of the dead, so his color is the color of blood, death, or magma from under the earth, red. Of course, there are other colors on the flags, for example, green, yellow, black of different shades. But, as we have clarified, most likely, these are the colors of inversion, that is, of some female gods, goddesses. I don't want to make unfounded assumptions about who they belong to yet, so I'll leave them unattended for now. In the end, to understand almost 200 existing states at the moment, no video is enough. In addition to colors, flags also have other symbols if you discard the most obvious drawings, for example, as on the flag of the island of Cyprus, where the island itself is depicted. Quite a lot of conversation goes on about the cross on the flags of Britain, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Greece. There are many different versions on this account, but I think everything is simple here. Where there are similar crosses on the flags of countries, the ruling dynasty is the Oldenburgs. Yes, in England, in Greece, and even in Georgia, the Oldenburgs planned to create Riviera. They had interests in Gagra and their palace in Tiflis, now Tbilisi. Yes, look at the flag of the city of Tbilisi. Here actually is the characteristic cross of the Oldenburg house on the flag. We have already talked about the Oldenburgs with you more than once. This is the oldest dynasty, apparently, acting on behalf of one of the gods, in my opinion, Zeus. And if such a straight cross is a symbol of the ruling Oldenburg dynasty, then it is logical to assume that in Britain, where both a straight and a diagonal cross occurred, this very diagonal cross symbolizes some of the dynasties, from his wife Hera. But remember, this is just an assumption. By the way, the symbolism of Zeus is not only on the flags and coats of arms of European countries. For example, the world-famous German optics under the brand Carl Zeiss is nothing more than a German transcription of the word King Zeus. Yes, in German Zeus is Zeiss, and the coat of arms symbol of Germany is Aries. Or take the American lunar program. Remember, the entire lunar program was called Apollo. What does Zeus have to do with it? And the fact that the program was called Apollo, but the carrier rocket which launched from Earth bore the name Saturn V, then from Saturn separated the carrier Columbia, which delivered the lunar module Eagle to the Moon. And if everything is more or less clear with Saturn and Eagle, then what does Columbia have to do with it? The thing is that in translation from Italian to Russian, Columbia is a dove, and a dove in turn is a symbol of Aphrodite. Let's translate to Russian language Saturn. He is Kronos. He brought his sister Uranus's daughter Aphrodite Columbia and his son Zeus Eagle, or as an option Prometheus. And the whole program bears the name of Zeus's son Apollo. Directness. Grandpa and Grandma are carrying the father to the moon, and he is frolicking there with his grandson. Do you feel it? By the way, two projects are being created in Russia right now. The anti-missile system Prometei and the space tug. After all, Zeus. Or here's another interesting nuance. Each of us has a computer, and not just one, including portable laptops, tablets, smartphones. They all use chips, processors, which are produced somewhere, and few people know that one of the largest, if not the largest, processor manufacturer is a company. By the way, the company and its factories are located in Taiwan, so if China suddenly seizes Taiwan, then, well, you understand, all world chip production will stand for several years, and China will get an unprecedented economic leap. But in reality, everything is even more interesting. In Taiwan, only factories are located due to cheap labor, obviously. But who builds these very factories and builds them even more? Secret company? Almost certainly you've heard practically nothing about it, well, except for those who love computer themes. So, this very company is unexpectedly located in the Netherlands, and this is quite strange since it is believed that the leaders in computer manufacturing are the United States of America, Silicon Valley, or Asia, Taiwan, Malaysia. But the Netherlands, why, how? But everything falls into place if we recall the past videos in which I long and persistently talked about the dynasties of Oldenburgs and their estates in Holstein, Schleswig, Mecklenburg and others. These are the same dynasties that gradually introduce necessary technologies into our world and control the world. The Oldenburgs rule Britain and half of Europe, The Oldenburgs created modern science, introduced the method of peer review of scientific discoveries, controlled Newton, Leibniz, and other geniuses. Under their influence, the ether was replaced with the corpuscular theory, and the concept of quantum physics was introduced. And the homeland of these same Oldenburgs, Holstein, Mecklenburgs, and Schleswigs is Holland. There was also the headquarters of the East India Trading Company, from where the cartographer Whitson came from. Peter, who later became related to them, was also sent there on a mission. Is it surprising that the latest installation for the production of processors, which they have now developed there, is called ZEUS? Is it surprising that most servers, for example Yandex, are located in the Netherlands? Yes, they are not just located there, but are registered there, the same Yandex. That is, if the Netherlands suddenly loses power, then the planet will really roll back in technological development. But we digress. So, although it's not easy to understand all this vinaigrette, one thing is quite clear. Europe, Britain, Asia, America, and the rest of the world are ruled by the Olympic gods. Zeus, Prometheus, Hera, possibly others like Apollo, Aphrodite, Mercury, and others, but the main three are still Zeus, Prometheus, and Hera. Hades, who rules Tartarus, is particularly noteworthy. He doesn't let anyone in, but he performs his functions clearly and scrupulously. The European part of Russia has long and firmly been under the mutual control of Zeus and Prometheus, the two-headed eagle. The brothers needed timber, please, oil, for God's sake, gas without problems, anything you like, just don't get in the way. Tartar. However, despite this, the brothers and even Hera in the face of Britain are still methodically trying to get into this very Tartar, each individually. Just remember the First and Second World Wars, where the eagle of Nazi Germany fought against the two-headed eagle, that is obviously in Oldenburg and Zeus, and then the eagle of the United States of America, that is, as we have already established, Prometheus plus Hera in the face of Britain. In fact, these sides fought each other for control of Russia. So what's in it if AID calmly submits to Zeus, correctly performs all its functions, and does not try to quarrel with anyone? What's the problem? I'm afraid the problem is much deeper than one might think at first glance, deeply, deeply in the past. Let's go back in time to the times of Titan Mahia, no, even earlier, to the birth of Zeus, or better yet, even earlier, to the very foundation of the earth. According to Greek mythology, and so after the world was created, Gaia from chaos or ether gave birth to Uranus. This is her son who in time became her husband, and everything was fine with them, except for one thing. All the hundreds and thousands of Uranus's and Gaia's children were monstrous titans, one-eyed cyclops and old men, many-headed hecaton Kairos. In general, everyone he disliked, all the monsters he shoved back into Gaia, causing her great pain. Well, at least he didn't eat them. And one day, his son, Titan Kronos, who was apparently normal and avoided being shoved back into the womb, felt sorry for his mother and castrated his father. Moreover, Uranus was so fertile that even the drops of blood and semen that fell to the earth during the process gave birth to gods, specifically the goddesses of the places, the Furies, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. So Kronos began to rule, and what do we know about his reign? The most famous myth tells us that Kronos was a monster who was prophesied to be overthrown by one of his children, and therefore he constantly devoured them. He didn't manage to devour his last child. They tricked him by substituting a stone for the baby. In the end, the youngest Zeus did grow up and defeated his father, forcing him to regurgitate all the swallowed children. Thus Zeus began to rule. However, it was prophesied to Zeus that his son would overthrow him. Therefore he did not follow in his kind father's footsteps and did not swallow the newborns, but instead swallowed his first wife whole, along with the child. So safe, says the mythology. And although all the Titan rulers destroyed those who could overthrow them, for some reason it is Kronos who is considered a terrible, cruel monster, while Zeus is a just god despite this. Although, if you think about it, it's not quite like that. Firstly, Zeus acted out of spite and repeatedly destroyed and punished his competitors, starting with his father and even ending with Prometheus. Zeus did not love people, forbade them knowledge and immortality. Compared to Kronos, yes, Kronos swallowed his children, that's a fact. However, they continued to live in his stomach, and after being vomited out, they grew into full-fledged gods. Secondly, he overthrew his father not out of a lust for power, but out of pity for the torments of his mother, to free her from them. Thirdly, and most importantly, he clearly fulfilled all his tasks. He loved people very much, and it was under him, under Cronus, and thanks to him among the people. It was that very mythical golden age, when there was no death or unhappiness on earth, when all people were well fed and happy. For some reason, everyone who portrays Cronus as an evil monster completely accidentally forgets this fact. After Zeus won, people were never happy again. Sorrow, pride, grief, envy, and death appeared. So who was the real monster? Well, never mind. Now let's look at this myth from a different perspective. If gods are just highly evolved beings with a specific mission about which I talked a year ago in the movie Prehistory. Imagine that on Earth, surviving after the first asteroid attack, the first ruler comes to power. Let's say his name is Uranus. His task includes the production of multifunctional bio or simply robots for the restoration of the planet. And there's Gaia, who, perhaps, is simply an autonomous factory for the production of such beings, gives him robots with a wide specialization of Hecaton Kairos, plus awakens one Titan after another. Uranus behaves very unprofessionally and sends the born robots back to the factory for reprocessing. In the end, one of his subordinates, that is, according to the myth, a child named Kronos, simply takes away his control panel and access to the server. For example, Uranus turned out to be extremely incompetent and he was simply deprived of control tools. Kronos, unlike him, worked beautifully, did what was required of him, and created ideal conditions for people to live in. With the only exception, since hierarchically he was lower than Uranus, he probably foresaw that the next operator waking up from anabiosis higher in rank would displace him. Well, who will like this? That's why Kronos was sending fresh ones coming out of the sarcophagus storage, with sleeping shifters to his own storage. In any case, that's the only way I can explain the fact that Kronos was deceived, being slipped a stone instead of a young man. This, in principle, looks somewhat unrealistic unless instead of the usual working sarcophagus, they slipped him a stone dummy. And at some point, the grown-up Zeus made a coup, and from that moment, two important things happened. First, the golden age for people ended forever. And secondly, although Zeus gained full power, however, all the equipment, all the factories for the production of parts for divine artifacts and the artifacts themselves disappeared somewhere unexpectedly. It's absolutely clear that Kronos, being a very foolish creature, foresaw such a turn of events and hid all these productions somewhere, leaving his conquerors with nothing. Now let's return to Prometheus. He knew in advance that Zeus would win, so he didn't openly oppose him and pretended to be on the side of the Olympians, which by the way still didn't save him from Zeus's wrath. And for some years, Prometheus hung chained to a rock with an eagle that constantly tore out his liver. It's also clear that people play some very serious role in the divine scheme. And Prometheus tried to fulfill the plan in spite of Zeus's will, first by giving people fire, then by trying to give people immortality. And indeed, according to Greek mythology, it was Prometheus who created people after another catastrophe. He molded them from clay. But without full power and production, it will not be possible to defeat Zeus and complete the mission in an open battle with Zeus. So allies are needed, or resources. Such an ally could be either AID itself if it can be persuaded, or Kronos himself. Ideally, we just need to find out from Kronos where he hid all the production, and Kronos himself is in Tartarus at AID-S. An AID itself performs its functions beautifully and does not let anyone out of the realm of the dead, even gods. We've got such a fantastic layout with you, we could even write a fantasy book. If only there wasn't one thing. But have you ever wondered why, after the Great October Revolution, the flag of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics became exactly like this? Red? With a sickle and hammer? We were told from childhood that red is the color of blood shed by revolutionaries for freedom, and the sickle and hammer are symbols of workers and peasants united together. And that's correct, everything is just like that. However, as we already know with you, the color of Hades is red, but the symbol on this flag has nothing to do with Hades. But it is an exact symbol of Kronos. Yes, if you didn't know, the symbol of Kronos is precisely a sickle and a T-shaped shawl, which has been stylized many times to suit fashion. Christians for some reason turned it into a cross, and the Soviet Union disguised it as a hammer. So, the red flag of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is the symbol of Kronos, imprisoned in Tartarus. It was during the reign of Kronos that the golden age of humanity occurred. And miraculously, communism, which the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was striving for, was also aimed at the prosperity and happiness of all people without exception. Do you still consider this a mere coincidence? Obviously, during the October Revolution, the power of Ida in Tartar somehow waned, and for 70 years. The ideas of Kronos came into the world, which tried to suffocate two eagles at once while fighting each other. So, from our semi-mythical, semi-mystical discussions with you, it turns out that the real hunt for ancient gods is not just for Russia, but for the ancient secret of the overthrown god Kronos. For ancient factories capable of producing unimaginable fantastic artifacts. At the same time, a parallel path is being developed to try to make people produce the necessary equipment themselves. But in doing so, they accidentally did not reveal the secrets of the universe and did not become gods themselves. That's why science is under strict control, not a step towards understanding the ether. Somehow like that. And the searches are not only in the territory of Russia. As you know, America has repeatedly tried to seize Greenland for itself, and this despite the fact that besides it, it is not needed by anyone. But for some reason, especially recently, America is trying with all its might to annex it. Donald Trump even tried to buy it, and having taken the presidential chair, has already hinted that a democratic revolution should take place in Greenland, and it will join the United States on its own. What are these strange metamorphoses? Even knowing that there are deposits of gas, oil, or some kind of useful minerals there. And America, and England, and other colonial countries have always preferred to extract with foreign hands, and here is a manic desire to acquire this territory for themselves. Yes, this can partly be explained by global warming, Greenland's emergence from the ice, and the United States' claims to the Arctic. All this is quite justified, but there is one more nuance. As you may remember, in one of the previous videos, I showed that the prime meridian of the past civilization passed through Greenland or Iceland. So, somewhere in Greenland, under the ice, an ancient mega observatory, similar to our modern Greenwich, Parisian, or Pulkovo, is hidden. There must be some high-tech legacy of that civilization there. But there is also another old map of Philip Kluwer from around the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, where Iceland is called the Island of Thule. If you remember, a German occult society was also named in his honor, which believed in the existence of a mythical proto-civilization holding secret knowledge. The Norwegian Sea on this map is called the Sea of Cronium, that is the Sea of Kronos, and Greenland is called Kronia, that is literally the land of Kronos. So there is such a hunt for Kronos and his legacy all over the planet. But where did he suddenly disappear? After all, Zeus could simply ask Hades to bring Kronos back for questioning. And by the way, according to some myths, Kronos was indeed freed, or he simply disappeared from Tartarus, or perhaps he did not disappear, but Hades stopped submitting to his brothers Zeus and Poseidon. Whatever the case, Russia does not submit, neither to Europe, nor to America, nor to England, even though the pressure on it is constant and tremendous. And the eternal frost between them is slowly melting, the climate is changing, and someone is making every effort to prevent this from happening, while someone else is already tired of the eternal cold to death. Subtitles created by Dima Torzok.